Good morning. I'm Jim Hall from the FreeDOS project. And so today I wanted to talk about why DOS was and really is still a thing. And so to start my talk, I want to go back in time a little bit. I want to talk about Unix. So this is back in the early 1970s. In fact, I think it was 1971. And Brian Kernighan, who was at AT&T Bell Labs, wrote a really excellent book about the origins of Unix in his book, Unix, A History and a Memoir. And so, in looking back at that history of Unix, you really realize that there was no uh, set plan, there was no roadmap. No one at Bell Labs ever said the next version of Unix will do this. Uh, it started where it was because that's what they needed to have. And they added new features because that's what people needed to do their work. And so, for example, there's a great story in that book about how Unix added the nroff command, the text formatter, if you're familiar with that, the nroff command, where the patent application office that would have to type up all the patent applications was planning to buy another computer system, and the Unix team really wanted to get a new computer. And so they basically worked out a deal where the patent office would buy a new PDP-11, which is what you're seeing in the photo here. The Unix team would put Unix on it, and then they would write new software that the patent application team needed to write their patent applications. And that's where nroff came from. So nobody ever sat down and said, you know what, Unix needs to have a really awesome, interesting text formatting system. They added it because that was just something they needed to have. And so it's the same thing with all the other Unix commands. There's another story in there that I won't go into about the grep command, which is basically somebody said, really need to be able to look for text inside files. And so Ken Thompson, who's seated here at the computer system, wrote a grep command. And that's how awk came about and things like that. And so that's how Unix was designed. Even the command names themselves weren't really like planned out. Nobody ever sat down and said, this is what the command set needs to look like in Unix. The reason that, by the way, you have short commands like ls, cp, rm, is not because they said that's the minimum that we need to type a command. It's because that typewriter that is actually a terminal that you see Ken typing at. And as Brian talks about in his book, that terminal had very strong key resistance. And so Ken Thompson didn't like typing long commands because it meant that he would have to type on this very resistive keyboard. And that's why you end up with commands like RM and CP and things like that. But as I said, the whole lesson from this really is there was no roadmap. Nobody ever said 5 years from now, this is what Unix did look like. It was always every iteration was where Unix needed to be. And if you skip ahead a couple of years, you look at what the personal computing market looked like. So by the mid to late 70s, you started to see these personal computers that would start hitting the scene. You were now getting computers that were inexpensive enough that you could buy them for your home. Granted, it was still quite an investment. The Apple II that you're seeing on your left costs, at least in adjusted market dollars, to be like spending $5,000 on a machine today. So it was a big investment that you were making, but it was at least inexpensive enough that people at home could afford to buy them. So on the right, you're seeing what's called the TRS-80. That's the system from the mid to late 70s. I think that was 77, 76, something like that. There were other very popular personal computers at the time. The Apple I was a kit that people would buy and they would bring home and assemble themselves. But you also had the Commodore system and a couple of other systems too. And then in the very late 70s, Apple released the Apple II, and that's what you're seeing up on screen on the left-hand side. I would argue that the Apple II became the most popular personal computer of that era. But what's really interesting is that just like the computing systems when Unix was around, every one of these personal computers ran their own operating system. There was no compatibility between systems. I mean, there was a little bit of source code compatibility in that the TRS-80, one of the primary reasons to run TRS-80 was you could program basic programs in it. And the Apple II supported BASIC. A lot of these personal computing systems at the time supported BASIC. And in theory, you could write a BASIC program in one system and port it to another one fairly easily. But generally, when you look at, for example, compiled programs, there was no expectation at the time that any system was going to be compatible with any other system. And also, these systems really weren't intended for you to live at the command line. Unix was something that was developed that you could run at the command line. It wasn't actually intended. It was one of the design goals that you should be able to live at the Unix command line. And in fact, with Unix, you could type a string of commands using a pipe character. And you could create new commands. Brian Kernighan in his book actually talks about a string of commands you can put together to check the spelling in a document. And I wrote an article about that myself, actually, for Cloud Savvy fairly recently. And so, yeah, you could make Unix do really complicated things by connecting these programs together on the command line. While these personal computers like the Apple II, like the TRS-80, they didn't have a strong command line, and nobody really expected them to have a strong command line. So, you had the basic ability to type certain commands like, catalog on the Apple II to bring up a category or a list, a catalog of all the files that are on that floppy. You could, use a run command to start a program, but in terms of connecting programs together, having that rich command line experience that you found on Unix, yeah, that was not something that any of these personal computers really expected, and so really delivered. And so that was not something that the average consumer was really looking for. The average consumer was really looking for a computer system that they could boot up and they could run programs, and they could also run a basic environment. And that's really what PCs in that late 70s era did. And so in 1981, just a couple years later, IBM got into the market of the personal computer. And what was their design goal? Their design goal was they recognized that the personal computer was now a market that was going to be very profitable, and they wanted to get involved in the personal computing market. And so that's why they designed the personal computer. And in fact, many of you may know the history of the personal computer. The brief version is that IBM created this product over the course of, I think, of about a year. And they used mostly off-the-shelf parts. They would use chips and things that were already commercially available. They didn't design really any of their own hardware. It was just stuff that they would take from this supplier or that supplier that anybody could get. That's why it has an Intel 8008 CPU in it. Really, everything on the motherboard is something that you could have gotten from any supplier. The only thing that IBM really had to add that was new was a BIOS, and that was the Basic Input-Output System, BIOS. And that really provided by the way, it's sort of a middle ground, a sort of a transition layer. Today we'd call it a hardware compatibility layer, but the BIOS really was something that applications and the operating system talked to that BIOS, and the BIOS would talk to hardware in turn. So yeah, that was really the only thing that IBM added to that personal computer to build it. But a computer is not any good unless you have software to run on it. And so they knew that they needed to have an operating system to boot up the IBM PC and to be able to run some applications. And IBM farmed that one out. They went out and eventually found Microsoft, and Microsoft was the one that put together the version of DOS for IBM. You might know a little bit of that story. That story was they went out to Microsoft went out to Gary Kildall for CP/M, but they'd also gone to Seattle Computer for their eventually found Seattle Computer's QDOS, which was stood for originally the Quick and Dirty Operating System. And it was just something that they were able to run on Intel chips at the time. Microsoft basically bought it and turned it into the original IBM PC DOS, and they renamed it Disk Operating System. Actually, Seattle Computer had already renamed it by that point because they realized nobody wanted to buy a quick and dirty operating system, so they'd already renamed it the Disk Operating System. But that's where the original version of DOS came from. They bought Seattle Computer's DOS system. And where did that come from? So that original version of DOS, that original QDOS with DOS 86, the one that became PC DOS, really borrowed a lot of its design ideas from another operating system called CP/M. And so this is what you're seeing here is CP/M 1.0, which came about a year after the original IBM PC. But CP/M was a very simple operating system. It wasn't it was another one of those operating systems that wasn't a strong command line. Nobody really expected that you're going to live at the command line like you lived at the command line for Unix. This was a system that would really bring up the hardware. It would boot the computer up, and it would let you run applications. And as you can see here, there's not a lot of commands in CP/M. There's some internal commands, obviously like dir is an internal command. So that's something that the command shell that you're typing your commands at is an internal command, is something that's built into that shell. And then it had a couple of external commands that you can see here in this dir listing. And so you've got things, by the way, like add, which is the line editor. It had a very simple help system. It had a program called Todd or Today that basically was a replacement for what we would think of as date and time on DOS. And some other things like, by the way, pip was a program that lets you do things like copying a file around. There were some arguments you'd give to copy a file. And DDT up there in the upper right is a debugger program. And so not very many commands in CP/M. Because again, the goal of CP/M was to bring up your computer, to boot your computer and let you run applications that were written for CP/M. And by the way, even CP/M didn't design their operating system, their interface, their command set on their own. They actually were influenced a lot by the operating system that ran on the PDP-11. So not Unix, but the actual operating system that came for the PDP-11. So operating systems kind of borrow ideas from other systems, and this one just kind of happens to have that lineage. So when the original PC DOS came out, so here's a screenshot of the original IBM Personal Computer DOS 1.0. So when that came out, it was influenced by CP/M, but it was kind of its own thing. Microsoft had cleaned up the source code to QDOS a little bit. They added a little bit of extra stuff to it, but mostly it was a system that was intended to bring up the IBM PC and let you run applications written for DOS. That first version was never really intended to, never intended to let you live at the command line like you would live at the Unix command line. That was really just meant to bring up the operating system and let you run applications. And so you can see here the commands, not very many commands available to you in that original version of PC DOS. You can see, command com is the command shell. You've got other things in there like, format, which will put a file system down on a floppy disk or a hard drive, check disk, which will check a hard drive. Hard drives, by the way, at this point, very rare and expensive on a personal computer, but they were there. Things like, disk copy and disk comp, very useful on a floppy-based system to compare two floppies, for example, or to copy one floppy to another. Interestingly enough, date and time were external commands in PC DOS 1.0. And so you can see them here in the listing. There's a date.com and a time.com. And only one exe program. Everything else was assembled and ran as COM programs. And so if you were to look at kind of what commands were available in PC DOS 1.0, this screenshot kind of gets you there. You'll notice, by the way, CLS at the top of the screen. CLS was not a command in PC DOS 1. And so let's kind of look at what were the commands in DOS 1.0. DOS 1.0 was enough to bring up, as I said, bring up the computer and run applications. Well, it also had a version of BASIC. Because again, why was it there? The IBM PC was kind of competing with other personal computers of the time. And so other personal computers of the time didn't have a strong command line, and they let you run applications, and they had a BASIC environment. And so that's what DOS did. Brought up the computer, let you run DOS applications, and it had a BASIC environment. So not a lot here. There's not a lot here in DOS 1.0. It wasn't until DOS 2 that we actually got some significant features added to DOS. And so it's still PC DOS at this point. And so this is where you start to really see some new features showing up in DOS. And so you're seeing, if I were going to kind of summarize what appeared, what was new in PC DOS 2, it was really the ability to have subdirectories. DOS 1.0 was intended to run entirely off floppies, and floppies weren't very big at the time. And so directories were just not something that anybody really thought of at the time. Certainly the Apple couldn't do directories. So yeah, having just all your files on one floppy was something that was in DOS 1.0. So DOS 2.0, we need to start organizing our files. Some people are using hard drives, although it was still pretty popular to use just a floppy-based system at the time. And to do that, that's why they had commands like make dir or md, and remove those directories by cleaning it up with rimdir or rd. Change those directories. You can now display what your directories look like using a tree command, which was new in PC DOS 2. And because you can now put files, or more importantly, you can put programs in these different subdirectories, you have to have a way for the command interpreter, CommandCom, to be able to find those different programs. And so that's why you had a path command showing up in PC DOS 2. You saw a little bit of batch processing being added in DOS 2.0. DOS 1.0 didn't really have much in the way of batch processing. DOS 1.0 had like a pause command. That was about it for batch. But you can see here we've got a lot of, in the lower right, you can see a lot of batch commands being added to PC DOS 2. And so you've got things like a for loop. You can now loop over a set of files. You have the ability to jump to a different part in a batch program with the goto command. You can do some very limited conditional execution using if. You can assign variables values using the set command. You can parse the command line using shift, things like that. So the very beginnings of a DOS command line really started with MS-DOS or PC DOS 2. And other kind of command line stuff that you're seeing in that DOS 2.0, you're seeing other programs that let you kind of act on text files. And so this is the first time that we had the ability to page through a file, one screenful at a time with the more command. We had a type command in DOS 1, but DOS 2 actually had the ability to look at that file screen by screen. So if it was longer than 25 lines, this actually lets you see the whole screen in a readable way. Find would let you find text in a file. Sort would sort entries in a file. So you've got these different commands that are starting to show up in DOS 2.0 that start to add to a command line experience. It was never, again, I don't think Microsoft or IBM's goal was to really make an operating system that was uh, you know, have a beautiful command line, have a very rich command line. They were not trying to reproduce Unix. So even though you've got some Unix-like commands like remdir, makedir, cd, things like that, they weren't really replacing or replicating Unix. And of course, another reason they couldn't replicate Unix, there was a licensing problem. But mainly they realized they had their own system here, and so it had its own origins. And so we're going to let DOS be DOS, and we'll let Unix be Unix. And so they weren't trying to replicate Unix. They were just trying to create their own system that was maybe had some influences from Unix, but it was doing its own thing. Now DOS 3, really with 3.3, this was really the first time that Microsoft got to market DOS on its own. This was the first time you started to see MS-DOS. Before that, it was really PC-DOS. And so what's happening with 3? Well, because it was really Microsoft's opportunity to kind of go their own way, obviously there are improvements inside the operating system, but there was certainly a lot of need to add some compatibility. And so you've got the ability here to, with the join and subs commands, you can now support older programs on now the new version of DOS, things that couldn't support different directories. They assumed they were running on a floppy. You can now do that with join and subs to actually make a directory look like a floppy, or make a floppy look like a directory. And so you can do those types of commands. But really, when you're looking at it, I would kind of summarize as sort of providing that compatibility, because Microsoft always believed that if you're going to have a successful operating system, if people are going to continue to use this operating system, and basically have a market, something that people can run a business on, they needed to have compatibility. So they tried very, very hard. Microsoft tried very, very hard to make sure that programs that were written for DOS 1.0 and DOS 2 could still run on DOS 3. And so, yeah, that's why you're seeing a lot of effort on compatibility. That's something you see a lot from Microsoft. I can fault Microsoft for some other things, but one thing I definitely cannot fault them on is their attention to detail on their backwards compatibility. So you can absolutely run these older programs on the newer versions of DOS. So DOS 4 didn't really raise the bar that much. Computers were becoming a little more powerful. You had to worry more about how much memory you're putting them in, so they had the ability to display that memory with mem. But DOS 4 didn't really add a lot to the game. So if you've used DOS and back in the day, and you remember when DOS 4 came out, actually DOS 4.01 was the version you wanted to use. DOS 4.00 was kind of buggy, but 4.01 fixed those bugs. 4.01 was didn't really add a lot to the DOS game. They had a kind of a neat little DOS shell that was new in DOS 4. I don't have a screenshot here, but there was a full screen text-based menu that was new in DOS 4, because Microsoft was starting to realize that, to be able to sell DOS to people, they really couldn't rely on a command line. Microsoft was starting to realize they needed to provide ways for people to use DOS without having to type at a command line. They were always focused on making things easier to use, and simplifying the PC. And so they were starting to, pull away, I'll say, a little bit from the command line. And that's why I started to see the DOS shell show up in DOS 4. That DOS shell was not very pretty, but it did a functional job of having a sort of a menu-driven approach to running applications on your computer. It was really DOS 5, by the way, that, in my opinion, really changed the game on DOS. Really made an intentional effort to change what MS-DOS was about. This was the first version that finally replaced Edlin as the editor. So if you remember Edlin was a very simple and, if you weren't very experienced, hard to use editor. it's like VI if you take away the ability to actually be visual. It was more like the Unix ed command, which is really what VI is built off of. So you were always scrolling from the bottom of the screen. You had a limited view or window into the files you were editing. You really had to know the commands in Edlin to get around. So people would sometimes sort of tape a little cheat sheet up to their monitor or against the wall to be able to use Edlin. And so, yeah, when Microsoft came out with MS-DOS 5, they realized they really wanted to improve that experience. And so they finally got rid of Edlin. Edlin was still around, but the primary editor they were really pushing was a full screen editor called Edit. And that Edit was actually a new BASIC environment. So BASIC had always still been part of DOS, because remember, the whole point of DOS was to compete with, or the IBM PC was to compete with other personal computers from the late 70s, like the Apple, like the TRS-80, which focused on bringing up the hardware, bringing up the computer, and letting you run applications, but also having a basic environment that people could type in their own simple programs. And so, yeah, DOS 5.0 still focused on that, right? Let's bring up the hardware, let's boot the computer, and let you run DOS applications, which can now do more things. They can access more memory, and we still have to have a basic environment. And so that's why QBasic replaced the original BASIC environment. And so QBasic, by the way, was a simplified version of Microsoft's Quick Basic compiler. Microsoft had a lot of these quick compilers that had Quick at the beginning of them. So you had the Quick C, you had Quick Basic. I think there was a Quick Fortran, Quick COBOL probably. So yeah, and so QBasic was a simplified version of that Quick Basic compiler, and it only would run in I won't say interpolation, that's not the right word, but it would only run the program as it interpreted it. So it was a basic interpreter. They also had a new help system. This is the version of DOS that had added a command that lets you support the mouse rather than having to have a mouse driver loaded for you. So major change in this version of DOS. Also, by the way, the ability to undelete files, right? So we're going to try and provide a little bit of helping people out on the command line. If they accidentally delete a file, they can undelete it using the undelete command. They can even do some amount of unformatting a floppy or unformatting a hard drive. Although in practice, I don't know that I would rely on that very much. But if it was your last, effort I just accidentally formatted a floppy that had my term paper on it, then yeah, that's probably the way to go. You started to see more support for higher level functions like EMM 386 to doing memory manager on 386 CPUs and higher. You had power to control the power on your system, because that's when you start to get some power management. By the way, load fix, load high also there to help you manage memory. And some of you may remember those DOS 5, those DOS 6 days where you're kind of playing around with the options in EMM 386 and load high and load fix just to kind of get the most out of the memory. And DOS 5, by the way, also added a new feature, which was the DOS shell. I mentioned the DOS shell that DOS 4 came with. The DOS shell in 5, in my opinion, was actually much better. It had a graphics mode, which was really nice, but it just kind of had, I think, a kind of a cleaner feel to running applications. And so you can see there on the bottom of the screen, you could add menu items to run your favorite DOS applications. Because again, the whole point about DOS was to let you run applications. And so yeah, you have the ability to flip between the drives in your system and manage files, do some simple file management. If you had a mouse loaded, you could interact with this using a mouse. And so again, Microsoft is trying to simplify the DOS experience and make it easier to use. DOS 6, by the way, didn't really add a lot to the DOS experience. And so you had the first time you had a choice command, which was really useful for batch processing. The first time you had a move command, which will let you move a file from one directory to another rather than copying it and deleting the original, and some other commands in there that kind of did some system stuff, deleting an entire directory tree at once, defragging a hard drive, things like that. You know, defragging and some of these other programs were things that you could get third-party utilities. Norton was a hugely popular application set that lets you tweak your system performance. And the Norton defragger, disk defragger, was something that I remember using in our house quite a lot because it really did improve the performance of your system by defragging the files. And so defragging means that as you write new files to a hard drive or a floppy and you delete other files and you add content to other files, the operating system is going to kind of split up where that file gets written on the disk, because it really kind of assumes I'm going to write to the first spot that I have available to me on the disk. That's kind of goes back to the original versions of DOS when it was all based on a floppy and we didn't really worry about that so much. On a hard drive that now could support 40 megabytes, 120 megabytes, you have a lot of files that can get spread across the disk. And so if the hard drive has to run all over the place to pick up all the data for a file, that can slow down your system. So you can get some better performance by running a defrag. So it would defragment all these files and kind of glue them together. And you had to run that every once in a while, every couple of weeks or so, maybe depending on how much you use your computer. You had to rerun that every once in a while, so that way you could keep your system performing pretty well. But generally, you're not seeing a lot of commands being added to MS-DOS at this point in terms of enhancing that user experience. And so I was using DOS at this point at university, and I had already taught myself to do computer programming on DOS. And I, like I'm sure many other people in the world, had been writing my own utilities that would make the MS-DOS command line easier to use, especially once I found Unix. So when I went to university, it was the first time I found Unix and started using Unix on our Sun OS systems. And I really liked some of those commands, and so I would write my own simple versions of those commands on MS-DOS. And so I would sometimes find myself using those Unix commands more than I would use the DOS commands, especially because mine worked a little bit better or had some other options, or certainly they had the features that I was looking for because I was the one who wrote it. So a lot of people were writing their own programs to try and enhance the DOS command line because that was just not something that DOS wanted to do. You kind of look at why was DOS so popular, right? If it didn't have a very good command line, why was DOS so popular throughout the 80s into the 1990s? Well, it was really because of these killer applications, right? You had certain applications that really were popular across that DOS market, across that personal computing market. And so you had, this is VisiCalc, which is the first spreadsheet program you really had on a personal computer. And there were other spreadsheet programs before that, but this is the first one that we can really recognize as a modern spreadsheet. It was certainly the first one to really run interactively, although the first version of VisiCalc actually ran on the original Apple II. But yeah, it was ported pretty quickly to DOS, and so this is a DOS version of VisiCalc. And by the way, you're seeing a lot of features in this original VisiCalc that you'll see mapped over to spreadsheets today. If you use Microsoft Excel, you use LibreOffice spreadsheets, you use Google Docs spreadsheets, that all, those modern spreadsheets have that look and feel that they do because they were all trying to eventually they go back in their sort of heritage to VisiCalc. But VisiCalc was a big program at the time, and it was replaced by another spreadsheet, Lotus 1-2-3. And so Lotus 1-2-3 looks the way it does, by the way, because it was trying to take market away from from VisiCalc, and so it used the same basic interface. It used the same way of referencing cells. It used the same functions. It was just all that and more, and that's why Lotus 1-2-3 became so popular. It was also not that expensive, and it had, with all these extra features, not that expensive comparatively. And so you found versions of Lotus 1-2-3 running in offices all over the world. And my favorite spreadsheet of the era is actually not Lotus 1-2-3. I actually fell in love with another spreadsheet called As Easy As, which was called As Easy As because, Lotus 1-2-3, it's as easy as 1-2-3. So it was basically the same thing as Lotus 1-2-3, but this was a shareware version of a spreadsheet that was equally as powerful as Lotus 1-2-3, but because it was shareware, it was significantly less expensive. And so this is a spreadsheet that I use, and so I always like to show it off. By the way, this version of As Easy As you can actually download from Trios's website. Trios is the manufacturer of this software. You can actually download a free copy. It's not open source, but you can download the software, and they actually give you the license key to enter to make it run. Other kind of killer applications at the time were things like WordStar. And so this is WordStar, a very popular word processor on DOS. And everybody at a certain time was running WordStar. It's kind of primitive to the features you're going to see in modern word processors, but it does the job. And in fact, you still find some people today in 2020 that like to use WordStar as sort of a distraction-free writing environment. And in fact, George R.R. Martin, who's the author of the very popular Game of Thrones book series, says he has one computer he does all of his work on, like his email and things like that. And he's got another computer he does all of his writing on. And that is a DOS computer running WordStar. And so he actually is running this version, actually, WordStar 4.0, to write all of his novels. WordStar was very dominant at the time, and it was only replaced by really WordPerfect. There were lots of other word processors at the time, but WordPerfect was the one that really took over the business scene. And so if you were a business, certainly in the United States, I don't know what it was in the rest of the world, but I think it was pretty popular in the rest of the world as well. You were almost guaranteed to be running WordPerfect in your office. And so WordPerfect combined with Lotus 1-2-3 was a very popular killer application combination. And there were lots of other applications as well. I mean, if you needed any kind of application, probably there was a version of it that was released for DOS. I have a YouTube channel where I talk about different DOS applications that ran in the 80s and 90s. And so I did one recently about an equation solver. Eureka, Borland made a software package called Eureka. It was later released as a shareware version called Mercury. And so if you were a mathematician or a physicist or a chemist, something in the sciences, and you needed to solve equations, you'd use this equation solver. So, imagine what kind of program you needed. And I can probably guarantee that program exists on DOS, because it was a very popular operating system. And because Microsoft pretty much bent over backwards to make sure that every next version of DOS would support applications written for the previous versions of DOS, meant that any software package you bought or basically invested in, you could keep using pretty long into the future. And you're probably going to replace that program when a new version came out that had more features. You also had games. Games were very popular. Doom was probably 1993 was probably on pretty much everyone's computer at the time. Very, very popular first-person shooter. If you haven't heard of it, you're probably living under a rock. It took over the world, and you're seeing remakes of it even today. But Doom was a pretty amazing game for its time, and there were lots of other games as well that came before that were also very popular, but they were all kind of two-dimensional games. There were simple puzzle games. Doom was the first one that really brought you into that 3D perspective. There was also Wolfenstein, but Doom was the one that really kind of changed the game and changed the model, and made a game that had dynamic lighting and had different. You could have walls and doors and things that were different sizes and dimensions. So Doom was really popular. But there were lots of other games as well. There were a huge number of games written for DOS. And so screenshots, by the way, you're seeing in the upper right. You're seeing Star Wars Dark Forces, which is one of my personal favorites. The bottom center, you're seeing Tomb Raider, the first Tomb Raider game. And in the upper left, you're seeing Commander Keen. That was Commander Keen Episode 1, which was a shareware game. And that was, if I recall correctly, it was called Invasion of the Vorticons. Basically, you were like a 10-year-old kid and you landed on Mars because you made your own rocket, and adventures follow. And so that was, lots of different games that were on DOS. So you had all these different applications that ran on DOS. You had all these different games that ran on DOS. And so that's why DOS was so popular. So if DOS was so popular and so many people were using it, why did Microsoft stop doing DOS? Well, that story kind of starts back in 1984. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this history, but in 1984, Apple released the original Macintosh. Only had 128K of memory, but that's okay. Now computers didn't have a lot of memory back then. You've got it ran off of a floppy disk, things like that. But the most important thing was it had a graphical user interface. And so you can see here, it's got this completely black and white user interface. It had a keyboard and a mouse you plugged into it, which you can see on the lower right part of the screen. But that graphical user interface made it really easy to use a Mac. You didn't really need to have experience in typing in a command line to run applications. Because remember, personal computers in the 1980s weren't really meant to replace Unix. They weren't trying to create this very rich command line environment. They were trying to provide a way to bring the operating system up, to bring the computer up, and let you run applications. So that's what the original Apple Macintosh did. It brought up the computer and let you run applications by just double clicking on them. And so Microsoft had to compete with that in some way. And so, they were kind of pushed into it. And so in 1985, Microsoft released Windows 1.0. It wasn't, I'm going to say it wasn't really well thought out. There's some stories that it was never really intended as a product, that somebody had talked about it as a way to say, Apple's cute, but we're working on our own graphical interface called Windows, because Windows are the little things that, as you know, are every application is in a window. So they said, we got our own thing called Windows, and it'll be even cooler. And then once they said that, then they had to make it. So that's one of the stories that goes around that first version of Windows. So the first version of Windows in 1985 was not very good. And in fact, it didn't even let you overlap windows. So what you're looking at here, though, is a screenshot of Windows 3.1. But that first version of Windows didn't even let you overlap windows. Things could only kind of bump up against each other. They couldn't actually overlap like what you're seeing on the screen. It was like a year or two later, Microsoft released Windows 2.0, which was better than 1.0, but that's a pretty low bar to clear. So Windows 2.0 was not that much better either. And so Windows 3.0 was an improvement still over Windows 2.0, but it wasn't that awesome either. I think Windows 3.0 came out in around 1990. Or maybe 91. And so then you had 3.1 and 3.11, which is basically Windows with networking added. It was called Windows for Workgroups. Look, basically, but all those versions, by the way, going all the way back to Windows 1.0, all the way up to 3.11, kind of had this basic interface that you're seeing here. Just obviously later versions let you overlap these windows. And so it was a very simple graphical user interface. It wasn't particularly stable until you got to 3.1. Although stable is still relative, but it wasn't a very particularly stable system. It wasn't particularly fast, but it did have these graphical applications, which didn't let you do much. It was, those applications only let you do the things that you could expose through the menus. If you create a menu to do something, then you would have an ability to run that feature. And so I didn't like that. I used DOS. I was a big DOS user throughout the 1990s or 1980s into the 1990s, and I didn't like Windows 3. It was not a very good operating system. It was, as I said, it was slow. It was very limited in what you could do. And so I preferred to do everything in DOS. And by this time, I'd written my own set of utilities that did different things. So I had a very rich command line. Even though DOS didn't provide a very rich command line, I had a very rich command line, a very useful command line that could let me do different things. I had written things that could be filters to let me process different files into different things. I could process LaTeX files and turn it into a plain text file, things like that, convert it into NROF, whatever I needed to do. And yeah, Unix or Windows was just not that interesting to me. But why did Microsoft keep going down, or why did I start going down the FreeDOS path? Because that's what I'm walking up to. Why did I go down the FreeDOS path if Microsoft was going Windows? Well, it's because you started to see these articles in 1994 that talked about there's a new version of Windows coming. This is when Microsoft started talking about the new version of Windows, which eventually would be Windows 95. But at the time, it was codenamed Chicago. And so you had heard about this new version of Windows coming, and I kind of highlighted the text here in this article. This is a theme you saw being repeated, that Chicago, this new version of Windows, would replace DOS entirely. And in other articles, you saw the term DOS is dead. Microsoft is killing DOS. MS-DOS is not going to be a thing you're going to use when the next version of Windows comes out. And I thought to myself, man, if Windows 4.0 or 3.2, whatever the next version is, if that's going to look anything like Windows 3, which it had looked like ever since 1985, I want nothing to do with it. I'd rather keep using DOS. And so I made an announcement in June 29, 1994, that said I was going to start up my own version of DOS. I'd already written a lot of utilities that replaced DOS functionality by this time and actually added to that functionality. So it was those programs plus. And I'd been using other programs that other people had been writing that did the same thing. And so I had a pretty useful DOS experience that I had the source code for. And so I said, let's create our own version of DOS that everybody could use. I called it PD-DOS because I thought public domain. That's what I thought public domain kind of meant, was that everybody could use it. A couple of weeks later after this, we renamed it to FreeDOS because we really recognized that we were trying to create free software. But the original version, as announced on June 29, 1994, was PD-DOS, this personal, or this public domain version of DOS. And that was the whole point. We wanted to try and create our own version of DOS, and we did. It was successful. People really liked that idea. And so if you kind of look at where FreeDOS went, in 1994, we had a fair number of releases, and we had alpha versions, which were basically, we had taken these utilities. We took these utilities that we were writing ourselves that replaced different features of DOS and added to it, and we were able to create a whole DOS operating system. Those alpha releases, they were alpha because we didn't have an install program. And so it wasn't until we had beta 1 in 1998 that I decided that FreeDOS probably should be easier to install. It used to be you would get a floppy with the floppy image with the FreeDOS on it, and you'd use that to boot your system and do a whole bunch of manual steps to get your system to boot. But with FreeDOS beta 1 in 1998, we actually had the first time we had an install program. It was a simple install program, but it did the job. And then later versions of that install program made it easier to use. But yeah, it all started back in 1988 with that install program. We walked our way through the beta series until 2004. So 10 years we went on without a 1.0. And so it wasn't actually until 12 years in September of 2006, we finally released a 1.0. We kind of walked ourselves up to it. And you can see we even walked ourselves up to it and got slower the further along we went. So we had, beta 1 through 8 And then we had a beta 9 release candidate, and that means that we were getting ready to release beta 9. And we had 5 release candidates for beta 9 before we actually were ready to commit with a beta 9. And then we had 2 service releases, SR. We had 2 service releases on that beta 9 to kind of make it better, because we weren't really ready to make a 1.0 yet. And then finally, we walked ourselves up to a 1.0. Once we had 1.0, we didn't need to change DOS all that much. Here's a screenshot of 1.2. We didn't need to change FreeDOS that much. We had reached the goal of being able to run all these different DOS applications, programs that you had written for MS-DOS 5 or 6 or even earlier versions would run just fine on FreeDOS. We had some problems at the time running some really tricky stuff like Desk View or Windows, but that's probably to be expected. But games would run just fine. WordPerfect would run just fine. Lotus 123 would run just fine. As Easy As, or all these DOS applications, because we'd really met the goal of replacing DOS. We were able to bring the system up and run DOS applications, which is really what DOS is about. As, by the way, kind of look at what happened from 1.0 to today, you're kind of looking at FreeDOS didn't change that much. We added a lot of utilities to it, and I think it's what added to the popularity of FreeDOS at the time. You had a lot of utilities that you found in FreeDOS. The older we got, the more features we added into FreeDOS, and that really came in the form of utilities. And so our util package set, because all of our programs are included as these utilities or packages, it became a very robust, very rich command line environment. You could now do so many things on the FreeDOS command line that you just could not do on MS-DOS. And so if I were to look at why is FreeDOS continuing to stick around, even though the world has gone, Windows or something else, it's really because FreeDOS is kind of providing a really interesting command line experience. I think if we had just focused on running DOS applications, it would be probably still around, but not as interesting for people to use, because it would not have that ability to do your own thing in the command line, to make your own kind of commands by piecing other commands together. But yeah, FreeDOS 1.0 all the way to 1.2 kind of moves slowly. You can see here it took 10 years to go from 1.0 to 1.2. And by the way, as I wrap up, we are actually planning a new version. It's been slow working our way to 1.3, just like it was slow working our way to 1.2, and just like it was slow working our way to 1.0. But DOS doesn't change much, and so you can do a lot with FreeDOS 1.2. And so there's not been a huge call to make 1.3 sort of a fast release. In fact, I don't even think the kernel has changed. I don't think the kernel has changed from 1.2 to 1.3 because it doesn't really need to. DOS stopped being a moving target in 1995. So yeah, we don't really need to change the DOS kernel, the FreeDOS kernel, because it's already able to run those programs. And in fact, people have been able to run even Windows. You can run Microsoft Windows 3 from FreeDOS. And some people have been reported you can install Windows 95 from FreeDOS. I don't know that I would do that myself, but some people have said you can do that, and that's kind of cool. People, by the way, ask me as we consider what's going to go in 1.3, they've asked me, why don't you make a GUI in 1.3? Why don't you make a version of Windows that you can include in 1.3? There's React OS, there's Seal and OpenGem and things like that are different graphical user interfaces that we could in theory run on top of FreeDOS. And in fact, we do include a couple of graphical user interfaces in FreeDOS, but I'm not really a fan of turning FreeDOS into a version of Windows. Every time somebody asks me, why don't you put in a version of Windows, make your own free version of Windows with FreeDOS 1.3? I said, well, go back to 1994. The whole reason we created FreeDOS to begin with, because I really didn't like what the idea of Windows. I wanted to have a command line based operating system that let me run these DOS applications, but still had a pretty rich command line. And so that's what we're focusing on in 1.3. So as you look at what is going to be in 1.3, definitely a hard line on it will be a 16-bit operating system. It will be single tasking. It will run one command at a time, just like DOS always has. It'll be single user, so they're not going to be adding multi-user functionality in there. It will be command line based and will run on old hardware. In fact, we have the ability to run FreeDOS on floppy-based systems. There are some people who have an original IBM PC or a PCXT. Those are getting really hard to come by. The hardware itself is probably dying or unreliable. You're getting a lot of people, though, who run FreeDOS on old Pentiums. Some people who run FreeDOS on 486s, and a couple people who run it on 386s and even ATs. Again, the older hardware you get, the harder it's going to be to keep it running because the hardware is just old. But yeah, the goal is still be able to run on that older hardware. Compatibility is key. As I always say, if we're going to change what FreeDOS is, you know, if we're going to change what FreeDOS is, then and make it so that it doesn't run these DOS applications, then it's no longer DOS. DOS has to be able to run DOS applications. If we change it to be multitasking and in doing so, make it so that we can no longer run these 16-bit DOS applications, well, then we're no longer DOS. Then we're something else. And why would we do that? But we still do look at, with 1.3, looking at the question of what is a modern DOS. And so we are all questioning that and saying, what are the tools that we want to include? What are the utilities that we want to include? And in fact, we had an offline conversation a couple weeks back that we're bringing back onto the mailing list about the utilities and the tools that we should be including in FreeDOS 1.3. And do we want to kind of pare away or remove some of the ones that we added that were neat ideas back in the late 90s that as we look at 2020, maybe we don't need to have those anymore. Not saying they'll never be part of the, the FreeDOS archive that's living over in Biblio, but maybe you don't need to include some of those on the FreeDOS distribution. But yeah, you can look at FreeDOS 1.3 looking pretty much the same as 1.2. Now, there are some developers that are working on a 64-bit, I think it is, 64-bit version of the FreeDOS kernel that will be multitasking, that will have a whole bunch of other features in it. That's a really big task. I don't envy them what they're doing because, again, the line I've always said is that because they want to be able to create a drop-in replacement for the FreeDOS kernel. And I've always said that if you can make a kernel that has all those features that can still run 16-bit applications like Doom, like Lotus 123, like WordPerfect, then we'll consider that as a kernel for the future version of DOS. So maybe FreeDOS 2.0 will have that. But my guess is that won't be for a couple of years. And so that's really where kind of FreeDOS or where DOS came from. Why did DOS come to look the way that it does? And where did FreeDOS come from and where is FreeDOS going? And it's really about kind of keeping that retro DOS experience that can still boot up a computer system and it can run those DOS applications. And we've mixed it up by making sure that we have a very rich command line on DOS. If you want more information, we've got a website here, freedos.org. We have a YouTube channel you can check out with other videos about FreeDOS. And there's my email address there if you want to follow up with questions. But thank you very much for this talk. I'll happily take any remaining time here and answer questions if you have them.